Welcome to the session on new undergraduate programs at Catholic universities, charting a course. My name is Alfred Perdoso. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Philosophy Department here at Notre Dame. And I want to note that, to begin with, that today is the Feast of St. Jerome. He's one of my favorite saints because, well, what he shows is that even grumpy people can be saints. And in the spirit of St. Jerome, I must admit that when I first found out many months ago about the topic for this year's conference, I had I'm embarrassed to admit, a kind of grumpy reaction of the sort, haven't we done enough thinking and talking and writing about this topic? Isn't it time to do something? I guess Dave Solomon must have realized what my reaction was, perhaps duly reported by my daughter, who was working for him at the time, because this particular session, in this particular session, we have three people who are doers of the word and not just thinkers and writers and talkers. Our first speaker this afternoon will be Thomas Smith, who is the chairman of the department, get this, of Humanities and Augustinian Studies at Villanova, a relatively new program, interdisciplinary program, which he will be filling us in on. Though Thomas graduated from Georgetown, he made a recovery by coming to Notre Dame to do his PhD in political philosophy. That's the way you describe it, right? Political philosophy? Yeah. We don't actually have that department, but that's what his degree is in. And he has several people. One interesting thing about this particular program is that it is a department with hiring lines even. And boys and girls, that's the name of the game. So, and lots of the people have Notre Dame connections too, I'm proud to say. Our second speaker will be Don Briel, the director of the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. It has become an empire with its own hiring lines as well. Don has created and ran for a long time and now oversees perhaps the most acclaimed, at least the most acclaimed in my mind, Catholic Studies program in the country, including its own terrific Rome program. So Don will be regaling us with some wise thoughts about action. And finally, the man who needs no introduction, right? Well, this is not the Alasdair, well, there aren't more than one Alasdair MacIntyre, but today we're going to hear Alasdair MacIntyre, the educator, perhaps not quite as well known as the author of all of those books. Alasdair, a couple of years ago, after some political battling in the College of Arts and Letters, established a program of philosophy, a minor in philosophy in the Catholic tradition. What you might not know about Alasdair is that he's one of the hottest tickets as far as undergraduate courses are involved on the campus of the University of Notre Dame. In fact, he and probably Ralph McInerney are the two most responsible for the fact that we have upwards of 250 or 300 philosophy majors at the university. And Alasdair will tell us about this minor and give us some idea of how it's going and what exactly he's trying to accomplish. So this is pretty interesting. People who are actually doing things. And so I'll turn the podium over now to Thomas Smith, and then the others will follow. We will have presentations of approximately 15 minutes, and what I want to do is all three presentations, and then we'll throw it open to questions until noon or shortly thereafter.
Thank you. And thanks all for coming, especially because it probably would have been much juicier to go to the Baylor talk than this. I want to thank everybody at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture for asking me to come. It's a real pleasure to be here, and especially to share the stage with two such distinguished panelists. I'm here to talk about a new initiative we started at Villanova University. It's called the Department of Humanities and Augustinian Traditions. And I was invited to speak about three things: the origin of the department, how it came about, the principles that guide our common life, and then what I think is the biggest challenge we face. So I'll just sort of go through those things briefly. I think it's fair to say that the department rose from a sense of crisis about Catholic liberal education at Villanova. Can people hear me? Yeah. This crisis is related to larger trends in today's academy. By and large, the academy has given up the idea that it's appropriate to help our students reach out for what I'll call an integrated understanding of the order of things. Many Villanova faculty have abandoned the notion that human reason aided by faith can seek such an understanding. The sheer volume of things to be known today and the pace of technological and social change also make teachers unsure about what to pass on and what to hold back. I think careerism plays a role in this as well. By and large, faculty seek specialized knowledge as the easiest path to tenure and promotion. Most of the younger faculty we've hired don't have much incentive to engage in the kind of work that an integrated understanding of the order of things requires. In short, part of the crisis is that the academy is fragmented into various disciplines, populated by various specialists, increasingly unable or unwilling to speak to each other. The sense of crisis is exacerbated by the problems we've confronted at Villanova with hiring. Many faculty at the university are indifferent or hostile to hiring for mission. Hiring well, I think, is a variation of the chicken-egg problem. Putting it very simply, to hatch a good egg, you need a good chicken. Even good chickens can hire badly. We all sit around a table and look at younger faculty and realize we've laid an egg. But as a general rule, if you have chickens indifferent or hostile to hiring faculty interested in seeking an integrated understanding of the order of things, they'll lay eggs like themselves. The new department was a way of starting with new chickens to get different kinds of eggs. So the university decided to pour considerable resources into a new department that hired well for mission and that acted as a kind of leaven for Catholic liberal education at Villanova. Now, there are problems with this strategy. One is that the department could have a tendency to become a kind of ghetto, cut off from other departments because of its special status. The other difficulty, of course, is that other departments tend to think this lets them off the hook on certain issues. And I've tried to meet that by insisting that the department is not a ghetto, but rather leaven. This involves two basic political strategies, which are not entirely cynical. When you hire, get other people in other departments involved in the hiring process. Invite them into the hiring committee, have them, our candidates interview the chairs, and then invite the whole college into the job talk in order to see the quality of the candidates we're bringing in. The other strategy was to create a hiring plan which first and foremost met the ethos of the department that we were seeking to create, but then also, in conversation with the chairs of the various affected departments, filled in gaps that they wouldn't be able to fill with their own hiring lines. In other words, make your faculty useful to other departments. And by and large, I think in the last 2 years or so, this has worked. Our faculty are increasingly in demand in other departments. So that's the origin of the department. Let me lay out 4 principles that I think help guide our common life. The first principle is place faith-seeking understanding at the center of the inquiry. Faith is not assent to particular propositions. It's a way of seeing, a way of walking through life, and a way of being transformed by that vision and that pilgrimage. It follows that a Catholic university has to infuse the disciplines with the notion that each is a way towards faith-seeking understanding. So in the new department, we want to pose questions like, what difference would it make to our understanding of politics, of economics, of of modern science or of literature if faculty in those disciplines took Catholic claims about reality seriously? How might those disciplines be transformed by employing the lens of faith? How might this lens enable us to ask and answer in a deeper way the most pressing contemporary questions that these disciplines face? We wanted to put those questions at the core of the enterprise. This reflects the sense that if faculty in a Catholic university aren't suffused with the sense that faith makes sense, if we aren't convinced that the reason for belief is that it allows us to see better, to ask and answer questions in a fuller, richer way as intellectuals, if Catholic education doesn't have that, it's lacking something intrinsic and fundamental. The Catholic viewpoint may persist, but it's robbed of its ambition. Second principle. To overcome the fragmentation in the academy, one has to strengthen the disciplines, not weaken them. This might sound strange for somebody who has an interdisciplinary program, but the more I think about it, the more I think if you're going to start an interdisciplinary conversation, you have to begin from the realization that the disciplines are in various crises of self-understanding. The methodological assumptions are so diverse. The work is so specialized. The assumptions about first principles and thus starting points are so different that people in political science, theology, history, or sociology increasingly are unwilling or unable to talk to each other. Also, many of these disciplines were crystallized around Enlightenment conceptions of human reason and nature that are no longer tenable. Maybe the most intuitive way out of this problem is to say that the disciplines themselves are the problem and they need to be overcome. After all, it looks like the academy is fragmented. The reason the academy is fragmented is that everybody has retreated into their own disciplinary specialty. And if that's the problem, the solution is to engage in an inquiry that transcends the disciplines. This is the way Villanova is going in some ways. We have more and more institutes and concentrations that proceed on the basis of that assumption. The procedure is simple enough. You choose to study a theme or area that invites work across disciplines: ethics, Latin American or East Asian studies, an honors program or a women's studies program. I've taught in some of these programs and I've been enriched by them. I think they have a place and I wouldn't want them to go away. But these programs can't resolve the problem of fragmentation. For one thing, disciplines are important ways of knowing. Human beings can't know every aspect of creation intuitively. It looks like we have to separate the cosmos into different areas of inquiry. To know the whole, one must struggle to know the parts. If we abandon the disciplines, we risk losing the rigor that comes from that kind of inquiry. I think the complexity of the world demands the integrity of disciplinary ways of knowing. So disciplines are necessary but not sufficient for understanding the complexity of the world. In addition, an interdisciplinary conversation that eviscerates the disciplines never really allows them to ask the questions that are fundamental to them. I think the disciplines are involved in a crisis of confidence, and one can't resolve that crisis by abandoning their proper work. My own discipline is politics, and I think Plato and Aristotle were right that the fundamental question for political life is what's justice, and this leads to the question, what's the human good? Today's political scientists, by and large, think those questions are unanswerable, and students only confront them in a course on the history of ideas. The solution to that crisis, and I think it's a crisis, is not to abandon the study of politics per se in favor of some interdisciplinary theme. The solution is partly to restore the discipline of politics to its proper subject and to find methods adequate to it. One builds a foundation for an integrated understanding of the order of things, not by undermining the discipline, but by strengthening them. Typical professors have to think that the disciplines they fell in love with can be made well suited to ask the most basic questions that arise in them. English professors have to ask things like, how does this use of language disclose reality? Economics professors have to ask things like, what's right making? Politics professors have to ask things like, what's justice? When we push these questions to their limits in our disciplines, we discover the limits of our disciplines. And then we need enough humility to go out and join a conversation with people from other disciplines who might be able to help us transcend the limits of our own. So wisdom requires mutual help, but it also requires disciplinary rigor. So we're not hiring generalists in our department. We're hiring people who have enough ambition to pursue the fundamental questions in their own disciplines, but enough humility to engage in a common inquiry with people from other disciplines. This brings me to my third principle. Philosophy and theology are the two integrating disciplines. I would say that whenever two people from different disciplines come together and seek common ground, or seek to share the fruits of their work, or seek answers to questions that they raise in their disciplines, but their disciplines can't answer, they wind up doing philosophy or theology. Most of the time they don't recognize this, but that's to their disadvantage, because part of the trick in pursuing these conversations well is recognizing when one is engaging in properly philosophical or theological work. In the absence of that common recognition, one doesn't know what standards to apply to the conversation. I'll give an example from my own experience. For the last 2 years, I've participated in a workshop in which faculty from the hard sciences and faculty from the humanities get together and try to talk to each other. And by and large, it's not been a productive conversation. The problem is an interesting one. It doesn't look like the conversation gets off on a bad foot. It gets off on a very good foot. Quickly, we take up questions like chance and necessity, the relationship of order to complexity, or the meaning of randomness, the relationship between creation and providence and nature. If my experience in this workshop is right, scientists ask these questions as often as philosophers do. The problem came when the scientists insisted that they needed to answer those questions as scientists using the methods they were used to. And that's when the conversation ended. By contrast, I would argue that these are properly philosophical or theological questions. Part of the trick of getting that conversation going again has been getting my colleagues to admit, reluctantly, that these questions have to be adjudicated on the basis of standards in philosophy and theology. That's not an easy task. So in my view, there's no way around the centrality of philosophy and theology in integrating the discoveries of the various disciplines, especially in a Catholic university. The other disciplines are concerned with asking discrete questions about discrete areas of reality, which is important. Philosophy and theology at their best seek something more comprehensive, wisdom about God and the world. So in a Catholic university that seeks an integrated understanding of the order of things through liberal education, but takes the discipline seriously, every faculty member has to be able to do philosophy and theology, whatever else they do. And this is actually the litmus test in my department for hiring, which in some ways is more important to me than denominational affiliation. Do you agree that philosophy and theology are the queen of the sciences? That's a much more interesting question and gives you a much better sense of what their intellectual life looks like. My fourth principle, build a common inquiry into the curriculum. Many of us in the academy are communitarians in spirit, but libertarians in practice. We just want to be left alone to do our work. There's nothing wrong with that impulse, of course. There's many times in a typical day when I wish people would leave me alone, especially administrators. But still, an integrated understanding of the order of things requires a lively, ongoing, common inquiry. Most of the time, though, we don't build that into our curricula. We realized that the humanities department wasn't going to replicate the fragmentation we were seeking to overcome. We would have to commit ourselves to designing and teaching a series of courses together, in which we learn from each other regularly. This quickly led to another question. What was going to be the focus of this ongoing conversation? Pretty quickly, we settled on the human person as the object of the conversation that we would have in common. The crisis in the disciplines flows in part from the reductionism of the human person in our culture. We live in a time that reduces the human person to economic function, to biological drives, to mechanistic conceptions of physics, to inescapable networks of power. And these reductionisms are enshrined in the assumptions of many disciplines. In the face of this, we wanted our common inquiry to affirm the dignity and mystery of the person. So we committed ourselves to co-teaching a series of 4 interdisciplinary courses: God, Humankind, World, Society. This explores the human person in relation to what we consider the sort of 4 primary fields of being: the human person in relation to God, the human person in relation to the natural world, the human person in relation to society, and then a course which explores our relationship with ourselves. I could list more principles, like the one that says if you need to hire faculty you trust and then let them teach what they love. But those four are at the heart of the department, and so I'll leave it at that. The last thing that I was asked to speak about was challenges for the future. I think there's a lot of reasons for hope for the department. Truthfully, I was worried about whether we could find people to hire, but I've been very excited by the quality of young people in the job market. There's a vivid sense among our job candidates that we're doing something unique, interesting, and necessary. There's a lot of hunger out there among young faculty for this kind of initiative. The faculty we've hired are really extraordinary, and I'm just really proud of them. The main challenge I see in bringing this project to completion is the structure of incentives that are in place in the academy right now. I once heard a well-published colleague giving advice to a senior undergraduate who was planning to go on to a PhD, and this is the advice he gave. Do your senior thesis on something you can turn into your master's thesis, do your master's thesis on something you can turn into a dissertation, and do your dissertation on, this is all the same project. Your dissertation, turn that into your first book. So your senior thesis really ought to be your first book. That makes it much easier to get rank and tenure. I imagine a student waking up at 35 and not knowing what to do with tenure. Unfortunately, the kind of incentives we have in the academy support that as a career path. I'm not complaining about making young faculty publish. They ought to publish. I'm complaining about the lack of patience with the intellectual life that's inherent in the structure of rank and tenure in the university, typical universities. The incentives that we have in the academy right now don't reflect the sense that wisdom is a lifelong pursuit and requires a certain hard formation. If we tell young professors to specialize early and often so they can get tenure and promotion, we'll wind up with a profession of specialists who can't reach out for the kind of wisdom that's always been considered the goal of liberal education. Alternatively, if we tell new faculty that their vocation requires long, hard thought, broad reading, facility with languages, appreciation for different ways of approaching questions, eventually we'll have colleagues who can read and write and teach wisely. The problem with that strategy is it might get you fired. As chair, I'm partly responsible for the intellectual formation of the young faculty I'm bringing into the department. And I keep coming back to this question. Are we encouraging faculty in their 30s and 40s to do the kind of spade work that's required to become a mature, integrated scholar in your 50s and 60s? And I keep coming back to the same answer. We don't. So the advice I keep giving to my faculty is understand the requirements for rank and tenure, fulfill them as best you can, but also understand that merely fulfilling them, only fulfilling them, limits the scope of what you want to achieve with your intellect. You need to push back against the rank and tenure process in certain ways if you hope to become a mature thinker. When I think about the obstacles we would encounter if we made the argument, if I made the argument, the rank and tenure standards ought to be substantially revised, I think I see the problem clearly enough. Many liberal arts universities have implicitly prioritized prioritized reputation over wisdom. It wouldn't be a problem if they prioritized wisdom over reputation. That's nothing new. People have been doing that since Adam. But if we want to be genuine service to society, to the church, and to the larger academy, Catholic universities have to figure out a way through those kinds of problems. One of the many reasons I'm excited to be here is to continue ongoing conversations to help me think through that problem better. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I'm grateful to have been able to take advantage both of Professor Gleason's history of the reality of Catholic higher education in the United States last night, in which he situated Catholic studies, and now with Tom Smith's reflections on some of the difficulties, practical and intellectual, in creating interdisciplinary programs, which I think, as he rightly says, are at a critical stage in the kind of contribution they can make to the renewal of Catholic higher education in this country. I should say from the outset that when we created the Catholic Studies Initiative at St. Thomas, which was the first in the United States in 1992, there was some concern about the language of Catholic studies itself, which, after all, is fraught with all kinds of potential difficulties. The whole idea of Catholic studies, the way in which it risks being understood as simply another cultural studies or area studies model, poses some difficult challenges. On the other hand, some of the advice we received from people like Janine Langan, one of the creators of the Christianity and Culture program at the University of Toronto, to avoid the language of Catholicism at all struck me as misguided. And so we fell back on a language which now describes a wide variety of programs in the United States, some of which I think are far more coherent than others, and some of which are not likely to succeed over the long term. But let me try today to say a little bit about what led us to create Catholic Studies and what we think the impact has been in the University of St. Thomas, my own institution. Christopher Dawson, the well-known Catholic historian, once pointed out what is perhaps more self-evidently true today than it was 50 years ago when he first noted it. The Western mind, he said, has turned away from the contemplation of the absolute and eternal to the knowledge of the particular and the contingent. It has made man the measure of all things and has sought to emancipate human life from its dependence on the supernatural. Instead of the whole intellectual and social order being subordinated to spiritual principles, every activity has declared its independence, and we see politics, economics, science, and art organizing themselves in autonomous kingdoms which owe no allegiance to any higher power. This reality, which I suppose we have come now to take for granted, has remarkable implications for the Catholic intellectual tradition in our own time, very much along the lines that Tom has described. Dawson went on to add that there is much at stake in the contemporary struggle between what he called the emerging unitary character of modern Western culture and the classical claims of the Christian tradition. For, he warned, in this unitary culture, there is little room for the concepts which are fundamental to the Catholic or Christian view, the supernatural, spiritual authority, God, and the soul. In fact, the whole notion of the transcendent. So unless students can learn something of Christian culture as a whole, the world of Christian thought, and the Christian way of life, and the norms of the Christian community, they are placed in a position of cultural estrangement, the social inferiority of the ghetto, without its old self-containedness and self-sufficiency. Now, this is, I think, a very important point, particularly since, I think, even within much of Catholic higher education, there is a functional agnosticism which marks much of the general curriculum of our institutions. It is certainly good in itself, I think, to escape the ghettos of the past, but we should be much more attentive today to the new ghettos we often erect to replace them. And it is in this connection that I would like to turn now to the emergence of programs in Catholic studies in the United States, although at this point one must say they are not simply limited to the United States, but are beginning to spread internationally. We find them in countries as disparate as Sweden and Switzerland. It is sometimes argued that Catholic studies programs mark a return to the ghetto of Catholic triumphalism and isolation, but I suspect that Dawson was right in arguing that the self-imposed ghetto of the contemporary academy poses a more dangerous isolation from the deepest human longings for the transcendent, for spiritual authority, for God. It is surely the case that the curricula and vision of Catholic studies programs in this country vary widely. Some may well focus too narrowly on cultural studies models, and I suspect that all of them, to a greater or lesser degree, developed out of a concern to recover the more integrated understanding of Catholic thought that has been in large measure obscured in recent history of Catholic higher education. Some continue to argue that the new emphasis on Catholic studies within Catholic higher education confirms the general erosion of Catholic identity for the universities as a whole. However, I am not persuaded that this is the case in any fundamental way. It has always been true within Catholic universities that only a minority of faculty have ever systematically engaged the complex intellectual search for a unity of knowledge arising out of a Catholic vision of reality. In the past, in large measure, this task was largely overseen by the religious communities that founded and sustained these institutions, communities whose own wide-ranging conversations established a framework and context for the university as a whole. And here, of course, I can't help but be reminded of Newman's point that the student really participates in liberal learning, not so much through a direct encounter with all of its facets and expressions, the full unity of knowledge of the circle, but through the awareness of the conversations that animate faculty and give those conversations a certain kind of integrity in the pursuit of wisdom. Although I well remember Fred Lawrence from Boston College mentioning the story that, of course, all faculty enter the academic life, I think, with the sense that we're now able for the first time with some leisure to read great books and have wonderful conversations. But as Fred pointed out, the faculty room conversations tend to focus on weather and sports precisely in the measure that they do outside of the academy. Certainly the decline in numbers and influence of these religious communities has left a large void within Catholic universities, and it is perhaps inevitable in our own time that now a more voluntary and diverse community of largely lay scholars committed to an ongoing interdisciplinary reflection on the integrity of Catholic life and thought would continue to be a minority of the faculty as a whole. Of course, these religious communities were not content to leave the rest of the faculty and the curriculum to their own specialized concerns, and they sought to create the conditions for a broader Catholic identity of their institutions in other ways. This had implication for hiring and for the curriculum. But the fact remains that it has never been the case that the university or college as a whole has taken on this integrating task in a systematic way. If we hope to recover this emphasis, once so fundamental to our institutions, we will need to create new institutional structures and forums for sustained conversation, new curricula, and an institutional willingness to hire faculty who have a specific commitment and competence for this kind of broad interdisciplinary reflection. I think in this sense that Catholic Studies provides one model for this renewal. In this way, Catholic Studies may be essential to this larger task, but before I turn to the positive value of these programs for the vitality of the Catholic intellectual life, let me list several things that Catholic Studies are not and cannot do. First, Catholic Studies programs cannot entail a retreat to the past, whether an attempt to recover the neo-scholastic synthesis, which Professor Gleason pointed to last night, or simply to retrieve some golden moment in Catholic higher education. There was no such moment, it seems to me, even though the tensions perhaps which marked the one period Professor Gleason described are obviously less confused than they have been in others. Second, Catholic Studies programs are a necessary but insufficient response to the demands of renewal within Catholic higher education. That is, they have a function to perform, but they are not in themselves adequate to engage the larger questions of institutional life. Third, Catholic Studies programs cannot substitute for strong programs in Catholic theology and philosophy within Catholic University. In fact, it seems to me that Catholic Studies programs presuppose and depend upon the strength of these departments and these disciplines. Whenever you have a Catholic Studies program in Catholic higher education allied to weak programs in theology and philosophy, or I would even argue in some cases in relation to religious studies approach to the study of religion, there are inevitably problems which make it very difficult for Catholic Studies to flourish. 4. Catholic Studies programs are not an escape from rigorous expectations for serious scholarship. However, in saying this, it is important to raise the question about the limits of the currently reigning social scientific model of research, and to acknowledge that, as the Canadian philosopher George Parkin Grant has noted, there are great questions which present themselves to all thinking human beings and which cannot be answered by the method of research. What is justice? What do we come to know? How do we come to know what is truly beautiful? Where do we stand toward the divine? Are there things that can be done that should not be done? 5. Catholic Studies does not imply a rejection of the study of other religious traditions and cultures. In fact, it presupposes the value of such study. And 6, Catholic Studies is not a retreat into an amateurish interdisciplinary focus, but demands a critical and rigorous scholarship. And here I agree with Professor Smith's comment that it seems to me that faculty who teach in these programs should have a strong disciplinary foundation from which to engage the interdisciplinary study of the broader Catholic tradition. From the point of view of the positive value of Catholic studies for contemporary Catholic universities, I would stress the following. First, and in some ways I think most fundamental, Catholic studies programs remind faculty of the ecclesial vocation of the Catholic intellectual. The ecclesial vocation of the Catholic intellectual. This is perhaps one of the most important contributions to be made, especially in a culture in which faith is so often now reduced to what one does with his solitude. This is essential if we are to overcome the reductionism which is an inevitable consequence of the increasing specialization of disciplinary perspectives within the university and the marginalizations of the claim of revelation and of Catholic doctrine within our institutions. However, I hasten to add that the problem is not so much that of the specialization itself, but of the absence of any larger vision in which to situate, critique, and evaluate such research and teaching. What implication does this have for teaching? Again, I turn to Grant, who has argued that there are two essential characteristics of good teaching, which are often absent, I think, in our institutions today. They seem self-evident on paper, but they are, I think, often ignored. Let me cite his reflections on teaching at some length, because I think that it is important for us in thinking about the role of Catholic studies and the contribution it might make. He insisted that there should be teachers who know deeply what education is for and whose wills are committed to what their intellects have seen. This latter point strikes me as particularly significant and important to retrieve. He continued, "Only such people can lead the young to reality. Only such people will have the courage to be teachers in a world which does not take the intellect seriously and which therefore thinks teaching is unimportant beside medicine or engineering, stockbroking or salesmanship. And the first consideration of such teachers must be to be steeped in the reality they teach about. Those who teach mathematics or literature or classics or history or natural science must know deeply the reality with which those subjects are concerned. That is why, he insisted, methods must be known as subordinate to subject. They are a means through which young people may be brought to partake in reality, as given in the subject taught. But the teacher must have more than simply a knowledge of reality at the level of his subject. He must see reality at that level in its proper subordination to what is ultimately real. He must have given his mind over seriously to the philosophy of education, notably absent, I'm afraid, often within our institutions. And this is necessary because if reality is known only in segments, the segment which is known cannot help but be distorted. For if the teacher of literature, however much he is steeped in the poets, has not thought about the relation of poetic beauty to the final beauty, his teaching is liable to end up in a rather insipid aestheticism. In the case of the natural sciences, he went on to add, in the cheapest kind of materialism. 2. The university as a whole depends upon the creation of such programs, which remind the rest of the university of the comprehensiveness and integrity of the Catholic intellectual tradition, at a time in which there is a tendency to view Catholic life and thought as a series of disconnected assertions and claims. It is in this sense that Pope John Paul II spoke in Ex Corde Ecclesiae of the necessity to work towards a higher synthesis of knowledge, in which alone lies the possibility of satisfying that thirst for truth which is profoundly inscribed on the heart of the human person. In order for this work to be achieved, he insisted, there must be sustained attention paid to interdisciplinary studies, assisted by a careful and thorough study of philosophy and theology, in order to enable students to acquire an organic vision of reality and to develop a continuing desire for intellectual progress. In the communication of knowledge, then, emphasis is placed on how the human person in its reflection opens to increasingly broader questions, and the complete answer to them can only come from faith. Here then, again, I agree with Professor Smith. It is not sufficient merely to hire for mission, if what is meant by that is simply ensuring that there are committed faculty in each of the major divisions of the university's organizational chart. The issue of critical mass has to be seen within the context of a distinctive vision, one which may not be worked out systematically by many of the faculty, but which must be vitally present and operative within the institution as a whole, and this will require significant structural change and a new commitment to hiring. Third, Catholic Studies programs can recover for students and faculty alike the integrity of the life of prayer and thought, now so dramatically divided, even within our institutions, of the relation of divine and human knowledge, and help to overcome the cultural and intellectual divides that separate academic programs from any real connection to the work of campus ministry, to service to the community, and to the church. Fourth, Catholic Studies programs are an important reminder that the vital mission of Catholic higher education is not merely imposed authoritatively upon our institutions from outside, but arises out of a rich Catholic humanist tradition, both comprehensive and venerable in nature. Because the University of St. Thomas's program is both the largest and the oldest in the country, it has become something of a national model. And so my general comments about Catholic Studies will largely be drawn from our own experience. And I will now say a little bit about what led us to create this program in 1992. Many of us at St. Thomas, by the way, a comprehensive diocesan Catholic university of about 11,000 students, roughly half undergraduate and half graduate, were concerned that the tendency to explain the university's Catholic identity in terms of remaining general requirements in theology and philosophy, service projects, values-oriented general curriculum, threatened to repeat the patterns of marginalization that characterized many once vital Protestant institutions in our country, which gradually relegated the claims of religion to campus ministry programs and separate schools of divinity. The once comprehensive claim that the Catholic intellectual tradition might engage and indeed transform any area of intellectual inquiry, from the arts to the social sciences to business and to law, had clearly been undermined by the growing pressure to understand disciplinary perspectives as autonomous and discrete areas of inquiry immune from any integrating vision or claim. It struck us as odd that many areas of our own undergraduate college had lost any explicit connection to Catholic thought, and that the present general curriculum required that all general education courses must devote considerable attention to issues of multiculturalism and globalization, but with the exception of the three-course requirement in theology, need not engage the Catholic intellectual tradition at all. If a Catholic university has nothing to say about the common good of political society, or the distribution of wealth promoted by capitalist or Marxist economic systems, or the notion of beauty in the fine arts and liturgy, or human freedom as understood by psychology, then it seemed unclear to us what the distinctive mission of Catholic higher education might mean at all. We thought at least that we ought to introduce interested students to Catholic claims to a hidden wholeness of truth, and we were struck by the fact that a new generation of students had begun to complain that they'd been deprived of access to an ancient and venerable tradition. We developed a series of core courses that provided the foundation for the major and minor fields, and then gradually added a wide range of elective courses, focusing on topics ranging from Dante to religion and public life, to modern Catholic writers, to the Catholic worker movement. In addition, we developed a series of 5 courses that explore the relations of the Catholic faith and the professions of law, medicine, management, engineering, and education. The undergraduate program, and was now the Department of Catholic Studies, has roughly 250 majors and 30 minors, with a much larger number of students taking occasional courses within the program. And I must say a great source of consolation to me is the fact that this year we have 125 new freshmen, roughly 10% of the undergraduate freshman class, who have declared an intention to major in that department. 4 years ago, we created a master's program in Catholic Studies, which now enrolls 80 students and has a joint degree program with the School of Law. We have a program in Rome that allows our students to spend a semester or a full academic year taking courses at the Angelicum, the Dominican Pontifical University, and living in a recently purchased residence on the Tiber. It is clear to us that there is a widespread desire among undergraduates for a focused study of the broad Catholic intellectual tradition. When we created the program in 1993, we assumed that the minor field concentration would be much more attractive to our students than the major because of the unusually large number of general requirements within the undergraduate college. However, from the very beginning of the program, students have been drawn to the major. We strongly encourage our students to double major in another field, and over 90% of them do so, and that now covers 45 different areas of concentration. So our students are double majoring in fields ranging from management to philosophy to American Sign Language to Russian. In 1995, the university created the Center for Catholic Studies through a significant endowed gift, which now supervises the work of two research institutes, the John A. Ryan Institute for Catholic Social Thought, Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. In 1997, we created a quarterly journal, Logos, a Journal of Catholic Thought and Culture. We now have endowed lectureship, artist and scholar in residence programs. We coordinate a wide variety of faculty development seminars, bringing faculty across the university into contact with the claims of Catholic thought. We have grant programs to encourage faculty to develop new courses, to pursue research projects which might bring the Catholic intellectual tradition to life in their own fields. We coordinate the Lilly Endowment Grant on the Theological Exploration of Vocation, which has produced a wonderful opportunity to reach out to, again, over 40 different programs within the university to seek to engage the distinctive claims of Catholic life. We're currently involved in a variety of international collaborations, including a significant one which links our center to the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, the largest Catholic university in the world with over 30,000 students, the Angelicum in Rome, and the new Catholic University of Ukraine in Lviv. It is certainly my experience that Catholic studies programs that have two principal characteristics tend to be far more successful than those that lack them. The first is the truly interdisciplinary character of these programs. In some cases, we've had the experience of Catholic studies programs simply identifying any existing course in the catalog which might have a Catholic theme or claim, drawing it together and creating a program. But the best programs begin with a demonstrated vital community of Catholic scholarship, both among faculty and students, and both groups indicate that their most satisfying teaching and learning has occurred within this program. The second, I think, precondition for a successful Catholic studies program is that it must have a wider institutional role, whether as leaven, as Professor Smith said, or as a catalyst within the university for the questions of identity. Otherwise, they will tend inevitably to be marginalized. And so, though we are much more hesitant to use the language of empire that Fred had suggested, I think it is important that Catholic studies aim for a very broad impact within institutions if they're really going to be successful in achieving their ends. One of the principal reasons that I'm so hopeful about Catholic studies arises out of my conviction that the Catholic intellectual tradition is truly liberating, not only for students but for faculty. It has a remarkable capacity to promote relation and renewal. In exit interviews with our graduates, they stress two primary experiences within the program. First, a deep sense of the comprehensiveness and integrity of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And second, a felt participation in a community of learning that unites students and faculty in a shared pursuit of wisdom. There has perhaps never been a time in which the need for that wisdom has been greater. In the crisis of Western education, Dawson pointed out that in modern Western culture, we may not be able to build cathedrals like Catholics of the 13th century or write epics like Dante, but we can still do something to make man conscious of the existence of religious truth and the relevance of Catholic thought, and to let the light into the dark world of a closed secularist culture. Thank you.
What I want to tell you about is a modest project. 22 months ago, the College Council of the College of Arts and Letters approved an interdisciplinary minor on philosophy in the Catholic tradition. They did so unanimously, proposal was brought to them by a group of faculty in theology, philosophy, and political science, and the 2 years of work that went into securing the agreements that underlay the proposal was very important, because the proposal was brought to the College Council with a common mind, strongly supported by Dean Roach and Dean Page, and it mattered very much, I think, that the College Council endorsed it, not just formally, but understanding what they were doing. The broader purpose of the minor is very simple. It is to give students whose major is in theology or philosophy an opportunity to understand the Catholic philosophical tradition in more depth, to understand the variety of standpoints that philosophers at work within that tradition have taken, and the ongoing arguments and conflicts that have been constitutive of the tradition. It has also a narrower and more focused purpose, to look at one function of philosophy as understood by the Catholic tradition, that of showing how theology can integrate the insights and findings of the secular academic disciplines into a more or less unified understanding of the order of things. The particular secular discipline which we chose for students of the minor to concentrate on is political science, and there are 5 required courses: an introductory course to the minor. Students must take 1 course on a major Catholic thinker in either the philosophy or the theology department. They take 2 political science courses, and then a final capstone course, which is partly a seminar. It will throw more light on what we're doing if I talk about 2 preoccupations in the introductory course, where we're concerned with 2 questions that are often discussed quite independently of each other. The importance, I think, in the work for the minor is the way in which we bring these 2 questions together. First is the question, what a human being is, what the relationship of soul and mind to body is, and the different positions about that relationship that different Catholic philosophers have taken. The second question is, what is a university when it's in good order? How are these 2 questions related? Consider the kind of contributions that each of the major disciplines makes to our understanding of human beings. Physicists understand the human being as a collection of fundamental particles operating according to probabilistic laws. Chemists understand human beings as sites for a variety of chemical reactions. Biologists understand human beings as emerging from the process of evolution through natural selection, as constituted by the ways in which cells operate within organic bodies. Economists, sociologists, political scientists, all of them have other particular understandings of the human being, and so do theologians. And so the question arises, what are the relationship between these understandings? What is the relationship between what theology tells us about human nature, what physics tells us about human nature, what history tells us about human nature, and so on? And these are the questions that in general go unasked, and therefore unanswered, in the modern university. It's nobody's function to ask them. Not philosophy as it's commonly understood and as it's practiced in major academic departments, not theology itself, which behaves even in Catholic universities as a distinct discipline with its own well-demarcated sphere, and certainly not physics or chemistry or biology or history. But in fact, it is how you understand the relationship between these different contributions that is going to determine both what you think about human beings and what kind of curriculum you think the university should have and how it should be organized. And very clearly, there are importantly rival answers. Even if these questions aren't systematically asked within the university, we do understand the difference between the kind of answers given, for example, by contemporary materialists, by physicalists, all that is in the end the understanding of human beings by physics, that is determinative of our overall understanding, as against the view taken by dualists. And one of the texts that we study in the introductory course is the Port-Royal Logic, Arnaud and Nicole, which offers a Cartesian view of the human being. Against both of these, there is, of course, Aquinas' view. And therefore, another text studied in the introductory course is Aquinas' disputed question on the soul. Now, this is a philosophy course, and in philosophy the whole interest lies in the detail. Kind of sort of large talk about principles that we often engage in, and sometimes rightly so, has to be replaced, as it were, at the working face by going to the arguments in great detail. And therefore, what we are trying to do in this course and elsewhere in the minor is to take people one stage further in their ability to handle the detail of the argument. That's also true in the capstone course, in which we look at the way in which political science relates to Catholic theology, beginning by asking what Augustine and Aquinas have to tell us about politics, later on looking at a 20th century Catholic political theorist, Maritain, but also looking at Robert Dahl's understanding of contemporary democratic politics and a great deal of empirical work on voting behavior and other political behavior in societies as different as the United States, Norway, Switzerland. The whole point of this enterprise being to be able to ask, once again, at the level of detailed inquiry, what difference it makes if you bring the concept of the common good to your discussion of the issues of behavior in democratic societies, both at the level of understanding what actually goes on in these societies and the difference it makes when appeals to the common good are in fact embodied in political life and in the goals of political institutions, as against what happens when concepts of the common good are absent from democratic societies. It wouldn't be possible for students to do the work of these courses unless they'd already done a good deal of philosophy and theology independently, and it wouldn't be possible for them to do the work of the capstone course unless they had been introduced in political science courses to the kind of inquiries that political scientists undertake. So that this is, in an important way, a course for seniors. And because it requires this kind of preparation in order for the work to be done well, and I may say the students in the courses perform exceptionally well. These are among the most satisfying kinds of course to teach, I think. Because of this, you get relatively few students who are able to satisfy the requirements for the minor and take it all together. We're gradually growing. In the very first year in which the minor was introduced, it was providence that there was one student who had, as it were, per accident, satisfied all the requirements for the minor except one or two, and was able actually to take the minor. In the second year, we had another student who completed the requirements. This year there will be 5, and we expect to grow, but never to be very large. What matters is that a lot of students who don't satisfy all the requirements take a great many of the courses. Perhaps being one course short or 2 courses short of the whole thing, but it still has an influence beyond the students who actually complete the requirements. And its importance, therefore, is in part symbolic. I'm not using the word symbolic in the way people sometimes do to contrast it with real. I think the importance of the course is real, but it is real as a symbol of what should be a much broader attempt to integrate the secular disciplines and theology, a task which I take to be a philosophical task. A good deal has been said about this task in general by the preceding speakers. Let me say the last thing. I think the minor is succeeding partly because it's unambitious, but I wish it were possible to be more ambitious. I wish it were possible, in fact, for us to look at the problems of integrating the study of physics with the study of theology, rather than making political science the only discipline with which we are concerned. But at Notre Dame, of course, one's precluded from doing this by the fact that we have a College of Science and a College of Arts and Letters. And it's very clear here is one more way in which a university can be defective.
Well, we have a few minutes for questions. If those of you who do have questions would line up at the microphone, you can address the questions to any of the panelists, and in turn, any panelist who wants can jump in. Okay.
This is the panel, Lord. I don't think this is all probably loud enough. It doesn't matter. I'm just a, pardon me?
Is there a switch up?
Yes, it is. What a technological challenge. I'm Tristan Mengelhardt from Rice University, and mine is a question to the panel at large. Santiago Zabala at the Lateran Pontifical University in Rome speaks about a religion without theists and atheists. It's a religion that's purely cultural. What I hear about your curriculum, it sounds wonderful. My question is, could one fully engage in its integrative power of philosophy and theology and be an agnostic?
The point of Catholic studies, I think, is to try to integrate the question of faith, the relationship of faith and reason in a kind of fundamental, intrinsic, and sustained way within that program. So the whole account of integrity, this is what I said, one of the dangers, I suppose, of Catholic studies is that it could deteriorate into a cultural studies model where you sort of examine the sociological effects of certain Catholic practices or Catholic devotional life, something to that effect. I think in this sense, it would be inconceivable that a simple agnosticism could in fact produce that.
What I meant is people would say, these are extraordinarily important questions. And if you don't ask them, you'll never integrate your full life as a human. But you might not think they could be answered.
Let me just say two things. First of all, I don't think it's possible to discuss the Catholic tradition in philosophy, and I would in fact argue this for theology too, unless one recognizes it as a tradition of conflict and dialogue. And conflict and dialogue not only among Catholics, but with others, including atheists. And in fact, any account of Catholic positions on human nature which doesn't take into account the importance of the conversation with non-Catholics and atheists in particular is very important. Now, one of the things we have to recognize, I used the phrase in what I said, talking about arriving at a more or less unified understanding of the order of things and of the human condition. But it's very often the case that the attempt, the movement towards a unified understanding is frustrated in various ways, for Catholic thinkers as for non-Catholic thinkers. And there is going to be very often, for particular thinkers or groups of thinkers, agnostic moments at which you don't know what way to go now, and this perhaps on some of the deepest questions. So I take it that both atheism and agnosticism play an important part in our understanding of things. It's very important that in a Catholic university one should be able to have dialogue with atheists, that atheism should be present, and also that one always never overlooks the possibility that for long periods of time agnosticism may indeed be a position that has to be arrived at.
I agree. Belief and certainty are not their flip side. Belief and certainty are not the same thing. Doubt is contained in belief, and in my experience, some of the most penetrating, searching students I've had have been agnostic. The only thing you have to insist on, I think, as a teacher, is you have to be open to alternatives. The fool in his heart has said there is no God. He was a fool because he was certain about that question.
Hello, my name is Julie Heil. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of St. Thomas in Catholic Studies with Dr. Briel. And my question is, specifically, if you would address this, Dr. Briel, but also everyone, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say, of course. Yesterday, the first question after Dr. Gleason's lecture was regarding moving from kind of a conceptual understanding of theology into living a life of Catholicism. And that's something I've certainly experienced at University of St. Thomas in our Catholic Studies department. So I'm wondering if that is something that you discussed explicitly as a department, how you go about doing that, and what the role of Catholic Studies is in that process. Thank you.
I think that it is true that one of the dangers of theology, if it is not understood within a broader ecclesial vocation, but simply as one academic specialization among many, that it will lack this integrating capacity that both Professor MacIntyre and Professor Smith described. And from that point of view, Catholic Studies is attempting to situate these perspectives, theological, philosophical perspectives, in relation to the Catholic intellectual tradition as a whole. I am persuaded that within our institutions, we need new forums in which that kind of conversation can occur. I think particularly for research institutions like Notre Dame, this is increasingly difficult to do because of the nature of the academic specialization that occurs. So in this sense, yes, Catholic Studies is an attempt, I think, to provide interdisciplinary context for thinking about how theology might play that integrating role, and philosophy as well.
My name is Gwen Adams, and I'm a graduate student at the Center for Catholic Studies, also at St. Thomas. My question is to the whole panel, and it is very often in programs, especially like these, where you're trying to understand and comprehend a tradition of thought, you find yourself doing a lot of catch-up work with the students who are entering your program. And Dr. MacIntyre, you had mentioned having a lot of requirements as a way to help do that. I'm wondering if you would address what do you, when high school students are coming into the program, very often you have to do a lot of things to get them ready for your program. What do you wish could be done on the high school level to get students ready for pursuing this kind of intellectual tradition?
I think a more intensive study of languages, particularly ancient languages, would help. History instead of social science, and better catechesis from grade school on up. This is speaking about my own children's education primarily now. These are the defects that I see primarily.
I suppose I would add to that, I think the study of literature, I think one of the things which makes undergraduate liberal education particularly difficult is that there really is no work to which you can appeal that you might assume students have encountered. I mean, the problem of reading generally, I think, is a serious problem in the secondary level, but increasingly on the undergraduate level. But there is no longer a set of classic texts which might illustrate and to which one might appeal about certain conventions about the moral life, about the good, beautiful, the true, and so I think that too is a serious defect.
Americans waste an awful lot of time when people are young. I mean, being a child is not a very good thing to be anyway. And so you might as well learn some things, particularly at an age at which you can learn a lot of things. And I had what I regard as in many ways an exemplary education. And Americans are often very shocked when I pointed out that if you didn't learn Greek irregular verbs, you were beaten. This is so. And people say, well, that's terrible. And I point out, well, I can read Sophocles and you can't. And in fact, the kind of rigorous education which introduces children at a relatively early age to real mathematics, to languages, including classical languages, to history, and literature, though it's important, literature people don't appreciate very much when they're too young. But something that gives them the elements they need for going on to other studies later, so that they know how to learn a language, how to move into another area in mathematics, how to learn the kind of mathematics they'll need for natural science. These are very important indeed. We have very low expectations of the people in our schools. This is particularly true of children who are in various ways economically and socially deprived, where we have radically low expectations we don't need to have. But we actually have low expectations of almost all our children, except for a relatively small elite group. And people are capable of very much more. And this is part, of course, of our understanding of human nature, understanding what people's potentialities really are. My very first job, apart from being a farm laborer, was as a school teacher teaching the children of the English upper classes, and these were people who had been some education had suffered as a result of World War II. Therefore, the question was how to bring them to the point at which they could pass the exams they needed to get into Eton or Winchester or wherever they were going. And I discovered that, roughly speaking, if you can teach the English upper classes, anybody can be taught them. There is no such thing as a stupid child. There are simply children of whom you've expected too little and not given the resources and varieties to do it.
Hi, I'm up here in the balcony. My name is Jonathan Malmude, and I'm on the faculty at St. Joseph's College of Maine. And my question is for the whole panel. Given the importance that has been placed in this discussion on philosophy and theology and on Catholic studies, I would like your view on, or your views on the presence of required courses in history and in English in the core curriculum at Catholic universities.
Well, I mean, I think theoretically the importance is critical. The difficulty, at least at many institutions, is that they are rather incoherent. In our own institution, I can say that a student can fulfill the history requirement by one of four distinct ways: an early or later European history, or an early or later American history, which but these partly reflect the somewhat incoherent state of history itself about what it studies, what its ends are, and so forth. But I think that in the past one could have assumed some more coherent and comprehensive historical introduction that might have been far more useful to undergraduates than this kind of set of perspectives isolated from one another. The current state of literary studies themselves make it difficult to bring a good deal of coherence, even on the level of writing, where much of the effort, it seems to me, of many in our own English department is focusing on the desperate struggle to find one's voice instead of development of some capacity to argue more clearly and coherently about a particular point of view. So, I mean, in the abstract, I think those two departments, which once were essential to the liberal education of our institutions, have largely now been drawn into a kind of isolated role within the institutions.
Yeah, I would second that. At Villanova, we have a pretty extensive core curriculum, very extensive core curriculum. It's one of our selling points. And when I go to these parent days where they're bringing their prospective students in, I always cringe when they say we have the most extensive core curriculum in the Western Hemisphere or something, because it's not exactly accurate. It's more of a selection of kinds of courses and kinds of disciplines, and there's no necessary correlation between one intro English course and another. Partly that's a function of rhetoric about academic freedom, I think. Partly it's a function of careerism. People want to teach out of their research to make it easier to publish.
So if I may generalize between both of your responses to my initial question, do you feel then that there should be definitely an English presence, a history presence, but it should consist of courses that are highly coherent, and they should be required within the core curriculum?
I think so.
Thank you.
The difficulty is actually achieving that.
I see.
Given the crisis in the various
But
disciplines.
you wouldn't approve of just simply eliminating such courses from the core curriculum?
No.
I might
No.
gather from what you've said.
But there's always an organic relationship between what's actually taught in whatever structure there is, and the faculty that you have present on the ground. Faculty are very clever about getting around requirements. So, how do you manage that? I don't know. But some quality control would be welcome, I think.
Thank you very much.
My name is Greg Biabout. I'm in the philosophy department at St. Louis University. My question is inspired by some similarities and differences between the first and third presentation of the program at Villanova and Professor MacIntyre's program at Notre Dame. They're both similar in that they're relatively new programs. They're different, I take it, in that the Villanova program has its own faculty, and as I understood it, the Notre Dame program is using faculty that are here. Maybe my question is partly directed at Professor Briel, but maybe at the whole panel. Have there been considerations about faculty being in the program? Are there criterion? Is this an ad hoc thing? And so also faculty that may be removed from the program, and how might this be handled? Is it an ad hoc issue? Is there a policy? I'd be interested in your thoughts on this issue.
Let me begin, Greg. We became an academic department 3 years ago. We'd begun as an interdisciplinary program. All of our faculty had been drawn from other departments of the university, but I felt it was essential that at some point we develop a faculty who had ownership of the future of this program. So we do have full-time tenure-track, tenured appointments in Catholic Studies, as well as secondary and primary appointments and adjunct lines. So we do draw faculty from around the university, but our core is within the department. We drew up our criteria both for courses and from faculty largely from the language of Ex Corde Ecclesiae, simply because it was an official document. It seemed to provide certain guidelines both for the hiring of Catholic and non-Catholic faculty. And so it gave us a kind of standard from the beginning to which we could appeal. We have not really had much of an issue with that, but I think it does give us a framework if we ever had to seek to remove someone from the department, and also for recruiting faculty for the department.
The answer to that is sort of in Villanova's case, is sort of an historical narrative. When the department was first created and I wasn't the chair, the policy was that the various faculty being hired in the department would teach courses specific to the majors, but also have access to courses in the various departments. So in effect, they'd be teaching under those other departments. If you were an historian, you'd teach a history course. Pretty quickly what happened was those departments insisted that they needed a veto over hiring if they were going to, in effect, give these courses to our faculty. So when I took over the department, I saw pretty quickly that if part of the issue that led to the creation of the new department was precisely hiring, that was unacceptable. So I went to the dean and argued that we ought to have independent access to the core curriculum, which he granted, and that's been a source of some friction. But I think if you're going to have an interdisciplinary program, you absolutely need that for your integrity.
One thing that attracted decanal support for the minor is that it is, as far as is possible, a zero-cost program. Nothing, of course, is ever zero cost. But I spoke about the importance of the discussions that went on for nearly 2 years, preparing the minor and enabling us to arrive at a common mind. And that common mind means that the committee of faculty who oversee the minor, come from the 3 departments involved, are very clear, I think, about what needs to be done and what is being done. And I don't see, there are no lines specifically associated with the minor. It exists because of the will of a quite significantly large group of faculty that there should be such a minor. And without that, it wouldn't be worth having. I mean, the notion that we should have a program and then look around for people to teach it would, I think, mean that it would be a bad thing to have the minor. And it's only in so long as we find that there are faculty who recognize the minor as having an important function that it will be worth having it.
Thanks very much.